Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 15th in a series of ICSVE Zoom panel discussions discussing various issues of terrorism and violent extremism. We're excited today to have 400 people signed up. I don't know how many signed up in the last minute, but 400 people signed up from all over the world, mostly from the United States and Europe. We got Bulgaria, Albania. Welcome, Albania, Portugal, Georgia, Hungary, Greece, my old homeland for 3 years, Lebanon, Finland, New Zealand, Kenya, and Latvia, among many others. And there's many friends and colleagues among you. I'm so happy to see Lori Fenstermacher, who I haven't seen for a while. It's good to see many friends and colleagues among you. Welcome to everyone. In our last event, we had Alexander Ash, Nema Cates, Michael King, and Jesse Morton address the issues of incel isolation and the designation in the court system of incel violent acts as terrorism. Sorry for my phone. If you missed that event or any of our 14 previous Zoom events, we list them all on our website. And we video record and we capture the chat and try to answer questions that are simple. We won't write you a whole book for chat answers, but we put it on our website. You can watch it later or you can promote it to others. And you can also view ICSVE's 250 short counter-narrative videos featuring mostly ISIS and Al-Shabaab insiders, as well as 2 new ones of former white supremacists and far-right members, one who crashed the Capitol in January 6th on our ICSVE YouTube channel. And we're posting links to all of these in the chat if you want to see them later. Today we're hosting a panel of Dr. Stephen Hassan, just got his doctorate and said he's going to hang it on the wall behind his head for the next meeting. An expert on cults, Professors Michael Barkun and Joseph Kubu, both experts on conspiracy theories, and we'll give a full introduction of everyone in a few minutes to address this very interesting question of what is QAnon and what should we do about it. And after we introduce each of our speakers and our panel speaks, we'll open up to Q&A, and we usually get a lively discussion and comments, so feel free to join that right from the beginning. Some events back, we did have some people post inappropriate comments. So I give a warning every time we hold one of these that if you insult someone else in terms of their religion, their ethnicity, so on, we'll boot you out and not let you back in the future, because we're very proud that we have a global community and so many different points of view, different ethnicities, different religions, and we welcome that and value it. We will capture all the chat and send it around. I always like to thank our speakers, our sponsors before we start. And today, I thank our larger ICSVE team, some who are present and some who are not, the US State Department, the European Union, UN Women, and we have just recently come out with the UN PCVE training manual, which was written by ICSVE. We're very proud of that. We'll put it in the link. And if it's useful to you, please use it and let us know how it goes. Also thanking our sponsors, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. And I always give a special shout out to the state of Qatar for supporting our Breaking the ISIS Brand counter-narrative project, in which we now have 260 in-depth video interviews of ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners. And that we make these counter-narrative videos of. We also campaign with the videos on Facebook in over 150 campaigns that Molly Ellenberg, who's with us today, runs on Facebook and Instagram. Let's see. So today, to start today's presentation, I thought I would just start with, when we look at violent extremism and terrorism, we almost always see some element of conspiracy theories and ideologies interwoven in the terrorist group or the violent extremist group. So if we look at the case of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, we see that the narrative arose blaming the West for attacking Muslims, Muslim lands, and even Islam itself. And when we had the American-led invasion of Iraq, jihadists found resonance in their claims that it was a war being conducted on behalf of the Zionist Crusader Hindu Alliance. And later in the case of ISIS, Assad's atrocities in Syria, followed by the declaration of a utopian caliphate, which came a decade after the US-led invasion in Iraq, in which 182,000 Iraqi civilians died, made it believable to many that the West was not a defender of Muslims, as Al-Qaeda and ISIS claimed, and that maybe an Islamic form of government might provide a better alternative. So we see that a conspiracy theory can look like it's grounded in facts when facts start to support it. We then saw a rise in jihadist concepts, such as the idea of taghut, rejecting false idols, and Allah wala wala bara, loving and hating for the sake of Allah, and the whole idea of having to fight jihad, that every Muslim had to fight jihad, and that Muslims that were true believers had to take hijrah and move to the caliphate. In the case of white supremacists, the narrative is that white people are being replaced by minorities, that there's a white genocide occurring. It's often attributed to a Zionist-occupied government or a secret Jewish cabal, and the remedy becomes one of promoting racial purity and a white homeland. And this comes through the collapse of multi-ethnic and multicultural United States. Aligned with this are the more extreme concepts of accelerationism, in which any actions that contribute to bringing about the inevitable Second American Civil War are seen as positive. And this is something that I watched in Greece when we lived there with the Greek anarchists, always trying to tear down society because they believed it was so corrupt, to build something new in its place. And with demographics in the US shifting, we see that white people will eventually become a minority, and we see many white men feeling disenfranchised as jobs move offshore, factories close, and white supremacist claims find resonance in real life challenges. So these are conspiracy theories that we see actively supporting violent extremism, and now QAnon is no difference. In the case of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, and as I mentioned in case you missed it, we do have one interview of someone that was in the Capitol that you can find on our YouTube channel. He was kind enough to let us cut a counter narrative of him. We see that among them are adherents of conspiracy theories, including that of white supremacist claims of a white genocide, the need for another American Civil War. One person I interviewed that was part of white supremacism told me what he was out of it already, but he said, when I saw what happened at the Capitol, I thought, okay, now it's happening. It's the Civil War we've all been waiting for. And some were believers in creating a white homeland and believed that they needed to preserve Western civilization and our American democracy. Anyway, the QAnon theory alleges that there's a secret cabal made up of deep state actors who are satanic worshiping, cannibalistic, pedophiles running a child sex trafficking ring. And they have a black and white worldview that's compatible with Manchean worldview of Salafi jihadists. And when I sat and thought about this as a psychologist, I thought, how did that happen? How did we get people that buy into that? And honestly, when I started thinking about it, first we had QAnon starting up in 2017. We saw QAnon start to show up in the MAGA rallies, in Trump's rallies. We saw Trump sort of sideways endorsing it. And we saw the June 2020 exhortation to take the digital soldiers oath, and many tweets made under the hashtag take the oath. But why does QAnon resonate with any part of the American public? And when I asked myself that, I thought, it came up at the same time as we saw the Me Too movement, and it came up at the same time as the Jeffrey Epstein trials. And when people try to fight against QAnon, they say, well, children abducted and trafficked into sex rings, there's only 1% of child abductions in the United States that are by non-family members. So it's completely ridiculous. Why would anybody believe this? But then if you start to dig deeper and look at how many kids are sexually abused, and usually by an authority figure, maybe by a parent, I like to call him Uncle Molester. And when we look at the rates, we see that 25% of girls and 7.7% of boys, and we believe that the male rate is probably underreported, are sexually abused at some time during their childhood. And 91% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by a family member or someone the child knows, not by strangers. So these are authority figures that tell them, you can never tell. If you tell, this is our dirty little secret. If you ever tell, someone will be hurt, someone will be murdered, you'll be offed, something bad will happen. So when these people grow up and all their life have this buried pain and secret inside, and then a conspiracy theory like QAnon comes along, isn't it believable that if 25% of girls and 7.7% of boys have been sexually abused and maybe never talked about it, would resonate to this claim? Because for them, it wouldn't be crazy. It would be completely believable that authority figures do abuse and that they keep it a secret. And they would much easier identify with the victims, the other victims, than ever tell their own story. Because to tell their own story is to bring up all the shame, all the terror, all the fear, and have to admit what happened to them. But to act on behalf of the child abuse victims that are claimed by QAnon is believable. So that's where I came when I thought about it. Then I also thought about when we look at recruitment to violent extremism and terrorism, and we look at conspiracy theories that support them, there's almost always claims with statements by authority figures. So when we look at ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, they usually make use of fatwas. They get rulings made by religious authority figures, either outside the group or ones that they elevate inside their group to back their claims and militant actions. Now with QAnon, we see President Trump, the leader of the free world, looking like he's backing it. So again, are these people crazy that they would believe it? I'm going to leave it there for my part because I don't want to take too much time. We have such a good panel and I want them to have plenty of time. So I'll introduce each speaker as they go. We're going to start with Professor Michael Barkun. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He specializes in millenarian and apocalyptic groups, political extremism, religiously based violence, and conspiracy theories. So he's perfect for today. He's the author of Religion and the Racist Right, The Origins of the Christian Identity Movement, A Culture of Conspiracy, Apocalyptic Visions in Contemporary America, and Chasing Phantoms, Reality, Imagination, and Homeland Security since 9/11. Professor Barkun has also acted as a consultant to the FBI. So the floor is yours, my dear professor, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about QAnon.
Thank you. Hello, fellow conspiracists. Let's talk a bit about QAnon. One of the interesting things about QAnon is that it's a conspiracy theory that's directed against another conspiracy theory. Q claimed, as Anne suggested, that Donald Trump has a secret plan to unleash a final attack on the deep state and its allies. That's the Q conspiracy. The attack's target was the subject of the second conspiracy theory, that is, the cabal involving the deep state supposedly dedicated to the destruction of the Trump presidency. Now, Q started out with specific predictions. Indeed, at the very beginning of Q's activities on October 28th, 2017, I'm using the male pronoun. Obviously, we don't know whether Q is a man or a woman. I'll use the male pronoun simply as a matter of convenience. He flatly predicted that Hillary Rodham Clinton was going to be arrested between 7:45 and 8:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2017. In the fall of 2017, Q continued to make predictions and to post short essays. But over time, clear exposition began to give way to a reliance on links to other sites and an increasing vagueness as Q began to rely more and more heavily on mysterious strings of questions. And that changed the relationship between his followers and his postings. At the beginning, Q's followers saw themselves as part of an elite, people who were privy to secret knowledge, who saw themselves as having inside information about high policy. But as Q's messages, his so-called crumbs, became more and more opaque, followers were transformed into interpreters and decoders, people who were trying to tease out the hidden truth in the cryptic posts. And that opened up QAnon's belief system to a kind of overlay or superstructure, all kinds of metaphors might be used, that attributed to the deep state liberal conspiracy a wider and wider range of demonic characteristics: Satanism, cannibalism, pedophilia, sex trafficking, plots of Jewish bankers. Some of this, of course, sounds like a wildly expanded version of the earlier Pizzagate conspiracy. Oddly, Q himself was never really turned into a heroic or a saintly figure by the movement. Instead, the result of Q's efforts was to elevate Donald Trump's status, since Q's vision placed Trump at the center of an Armageddon-like final battle, a climactic struggle between the forces of virtue and the satanic alliance of bureaucrats, liberals, Democrats, and their allies. And the longer Q posted, the more Trump was transformed into a kind of messianic figure. If those of you of, what can I say euphemistically, those of you of a certain age can think back to the world in, say, 1985, the Q phenomenon would have been unthinkable. It would have been locked away on the fringe. Now, of course, it's part of conventional political discourse. That has been made possible by the rise of communications media with few, if any, gatekeepers, the internet and social media, where fringe ideas can now migrate easily into places where they can reach mass audiences, places where they never could have been in even the relatively recent past. And of course, Trump himself became the first major political figure to systematically bring fringe ideas into the mainstream, as were many of his followers. So it's hardly surprising that there has been a rapprochement between Trump and QAnon. As QAnon's posts continued and were studied and elaborated by followers over the last 3 years, what began as an internet curiosity began to turn into a kind of quasi-religion. Now, one has to be careful about this, and the reason one has to be careful is that the whole QAnon phenomenon is radically decentralized. We're talking about something that has no real organization, that's highly fragmented, where there's no leadership in the conventional sense, and where uh, there is an enormous amount of, uh, in a way, continual improvisation. Nonetheless, as Q's messages became more and more cloaked in mystery, he took on the role of an oracle, sending cryptic messages about Trump's salvationist plans. And while he was doing this, Q regularly larded his messages with references to God, suggesting that what was at stake wasn't simply political survival, it was some kind of ultimate, transcendent good that was either going to be preserved or was going to be lost forever. So it was natural that those who committed themselves to Q, or I suppose more accurately to Q's message, increasingly did so as an act of faith. Now, the problem, of course, not only with Q, but others uh, who do the same thing, namely make concrete predictions about the future, is that they are always at the mercy of cognitive dissonance. This was a potential problem with Q from the very beginning. As I indicated, really from the outset, he began to make very specific predictions, like the prediction about the arrest of Hillary Clinton, and of course, it turned out to be wrong. Um, that did not unduly disturb the faithful because uh, they reasoned that as long as Trump remained president, it was possible that he had his own reasons for delaying the fulfillment of the prediction. Uh, QAnon went on to make other predictions, and of course, those two were not fulfilled. But the faithful said to themselves, "Well, uh, the president must have his reasons, and he's still president, and he can change his plans, and at some time in the future, these predictions too will be fulfilled. Uh, Perhaps he can wait until the very last minute. Perhaps he will wait and make his most dramatic move just before the inauguration of his putative successor." But of course, after Joseph Biden became president, a cognitive dissonance situation arose that could not be readily rationalized away. The likelihood is that there will be, perhaps there has already been, massive defections from QAnon, who has been silent through the whole post inauguration period. I should add, I did not check uh, the QAnon site this morning, so you know, it's possible there's been a last minute posting, but to my knowledge, there has been nothing since the inauguration. Uh, but it's hard to abandon something in which you have invested so much of yourself. Um, this is, of course, similar to the famous case of the Millerite Second Coming predictions in 1843-44, and like that, I think what we're going to see is a combination of mass defections and a core of the most committed who will remain loyal and will construct uh, some explanation that will allow them to retain their faith, even in the present circumstances, probably utilizing some combination of the myth of the stolen election and the promise of a Trump candidacy in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. And I realized that before I introduce our next speaker, that I meant to unmask Q in this meeting and admit it that I'm Q. And she is a woman. Just kidding.
Yeah.
But anyway, so now we're going to Professor Joseph Kuhil, who is the founder and CEO of J. Kuhil Professional Writing, Education, and Media. He served as a research historian and History of Parliament Trust and history professor at Duquesne University and Penn State. He specializes in the history of 19th century Britain and Ireland, as he pointed out with all the books behind him. And he's the author of Ireland, A Short History and Ideas of the Liberal Party, Perceptions, Agendas, and Liberal Politics in the House of Commons. Dr. Joseph Kuhil has been studying the ways in which the understanding and learning about history have been undermined by simple rumors, urban legends, false narratives, conspiracy theories, and hero worship. And he is a clever man who has started the Professor Buzzkill History podcast, which we probably should all sign up to. And he tries to present clear explanations of why these things are damaging to history and public discourse. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everyone for letting me in. I come in as sort of an outsider. I'm a generalist and a historian in these matters, but I think it's very, very important when we study QAnon and conspiracy theories in general and Trump worship and things like that, that we realize that this is a very common theme in human history. And we only have to go back certainly into the 1840s, like Professor Barkham said, but also to what surprises me about QAnon is how much it reminds me of the famous Protocols of the Elders of Zion controversy in the early 20th century. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a czarist fake publication which held to be or pretended to be a Jewish guidebook for Zionist control of the world. And this was partly brought up because in the second half of the 19th century, Russia gained control over a lot of Eastern European lands and a lot of people of Jewish descent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this built up on a paranoia, longstanding paranoia about Jewish control and Jewish, tentacles and all sorts of aspects of world politics and world finance. And it had a tremendously negative effect, a tremendously horrific effect if you think of the way in which the czars at that time treated not only Jewish groups, but other suspected groups. And of course, it was inculcated almost wholeheartedly by Adolf Hitler and even people like Henry Ford, who distributed it and had it printed and distributed in the 1930s and 40s in the United States. Now, the interesting thing about this, it was proved to be a fake. It was proved to be a completely made up document. Any expert on Jewish thinking and Jewish history and Jewish politics at the time showed that not only is it obviously fake, but there were no consistencies with the way in which Jewish, indeed Zionists, had developed in Europe at the time. But that was, in a way, it was too late. And I hope this is one of the things we can come to in the discussion, is what do we do when these theories are out there? And even though they're debunked, right, they continue. So Hitler, of course, inculcates them into Mein Kampf and a lot of his other writings, a lot of his other speeches, and it becomes very, 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 very popular. And continues, by the way, I'm told, in some Middle Eastern countries, it is still believed. But this also happens in all kinds of other ways. We see in the anti-communist, the communist paranoia in the United States in the 30s and 40s and 50s, a shocking level of willingness to jump on the barest minimum of a hint of a communist conspiracy in the United States, mainly when Joe McCarthy stands up and says he has a list of 200 something Soviet agents in the American government, and of course never shows it to anybody. And then the constantly latched onto by people who then follow almost exactly the same pattern that we've seen in these other conspiracies. The guilt by association, taking a small example of a certain number of lawyers in the 1930s being part of the Lawyers Guild, a labor union for lawyers in the 30s that was left-leaning, and then spinning that out into a much larger narrative that claims that there are all these sort of tentacles, again, existing throughout the American government, and that the American government is on the verge of being taken over by communists. And of course, McCarthy and Nixon were the people who argued that they're the ones who knew. They're the ones who knew who was pink down to their underwear and who wasn't. And therefore, they set in motion a whole decade of completely wasted time searching for infiltrators in the American government, causing all kinds of problems and, in fact, tragedies for certain people in their careers. And it continues on and on. The John Birch Society in American history is another example. That's sort of a continuation of the anti-communism and anti-communist conspiracy theories of the 30s and 40s. That becomes a significant factor and a significant problem for the Republican Party in the 40s and 50s. And many people argue, and I think it's completely true, that one of the reasons that General Eisenhower ran for president in 1952 was to draw the Republican Party away from the extremists who were starting to gravitate towards Robert Taft, who wasn't necessarily a Bircher himself, but there were a number of Birchers in that sort of circle, and pull the Republican Party back to its center. This, however, just continued to drive the John Birch Society further underground and further promote its beliefs. Now, I want to stop there just briefly and say one of the things that's so misunderstood about conspiracy theories, conspiracy groups, and what I call conspiracy mongering, what experts call conspiracy ideation, is the fact that it adapts to the technology of the time. So, for instance, the worst thing that ever happened in American history, in the study of American history, in my view, is what's called the lost cause narrative about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And that spread the seeds and enhanced tremendous racial discrimination and horrible violence throughout the South and parts of the North for decades and decades and decades. And that was all done by the printing press and eventually by the telegraph and really old school technology. Well, the same thing was going on with right-wing groups like the John Birch Society, who perfected a sort of mimeograph version of the internet and would write these newsletters that they sent out to people on mailing lists. And those were very, very effective in gaining adherence, and also effective in expanding their influence. So you have by the Eisenhower's, for instance, first administration, political cartoons where there's a famous one, he's looking out the window and there's the figure of a man who represents the Republican Party being attacked / mugged by the John Birch Society. And Eisenhower's talking on the phone saying, I thought I had handled this in 52, yet it's still a problem. Now, what I argue on the show and what I've argued in other avenues is that, in other venues, is that this becomes a serious problem especially when it gets taken up by messianic figures, say Donald Trump, or if not taken up by Donald Trump, then certainly, allowed to thrive under Donald Trump's leadership. I don't think Donald Trump reads any of this stuff or read any of this stuff, but I think it's very clear that he, because of his sort of narcissism, he's willing and eager to promote anything that any group that he says likes him, which is one of his quotes about QAnon. But the difference now, it seems to me, and I don't know that this is the case with previous conspiracies, is that the internet allows QAnon especially to create what are known as these Q drops, which are little posts on the QAnon chat sites in which they're sort of puzzles slash, I don't want to say workbooks or anything that elaborate, but there's little sort of mysteries that you as a follower are supposed to solve. And this adds a whole new level of participation in conspiracy mongering that is, as far as I know, is unknown in other periods of history. Probably because, as Professor Barkett says, because the internet has made it so possible. And from what I understand, it's this participation, it's this ability to follow these puzzles and to solve them and to then promote your solution on QAnon sites that causes true believers to believe that to then project it further into the rest of their social network, if you will. That seems to me a very, very dangerous element of this whole process. And even though people seem to be shedding QAnon right now, it's that process that worries me. That, for instance, it may not be QAnon, but the next group that comes along will adapt this paradigm or this way of working, where they make it sort of a game for its members to then enhance their own status within the organization. I don't think we're seeing a sort of Jonestown cult situation anymore, where there's the one messianic leader who preaches the gospel to his followers, and then they all follow it like a spiritual text. I think we see with QAnon, I think we see an enhanced participation among the lieutenants and the foot soldiers in QAnon groups across the QAnon spectrum. Now, one hopes that technology also allows us to debunk these things as they go along, but I'm finding, and I have always found, that it doesn't do debunking, almost does no good at all. Professor Barker and Professor Hassan can help me with this, I think, because no matter how many times you debunk a certain myth or show that certain conspiracy theories have no foundation or there's no evidence, you're already way, way, way behind the game. So it's like this terrible situation of playing whack-a-mole, and it doesn't matter how much information you pump out, it seems we're always behind. So when we come back to the discussion, I'd like to propose what I hope is a method to try to nip these things in the bud. But the problem is they've always been with us, and they've always used the current technology to its absolute best effect, right? Henry Ford used tremendous power of the printing press to distribute the protocols of the Elders of Zion and have them taught in some schools. So it's not just a new thing, and that's what worries me more than anything, is the persistence and the hardiness of this way of thinking.
Thank you for that. And I think that's really important point. And Professor Barkun said it as well, that we don't have gatekeepers anymore. And we also live in these silos of different realities based on the news we're consuming. So it is really frightening. But let's give time now for Dr. Hassan, who I've known for years, and I think is going to bring this all down to the practical level, because we've been talking theoretically. But Steve Hassan is a mental health professional who's been helping people leave destructive cults since 1976, after he himself was deprogrammed from Sun Moon's Unification Church, the Moonies. He just completed his doctoral dissertation, although he's been working for years and writing books. And he's created the BITE model of authoritarian control, undue influence, thought reform, brainwashing, mind control, trafficking, and the law. And it contains a comprehensive literature review. And I'm very interested, I hope you'll share a bit about the BITE model, Dr. Hassan. And he's researched, written, and participated in TED Talks talking about the dismantling of Q-Anon. He's the author of 4 books. I think I've read them all and I really like them. Combating Cult Mind Control, Rescue and Recovery from Destructive Cults, Releasing the Bonds, Empowering People to Think for Themselves. And his website is called Freedom of Mind, which is a really interesting concept. How do you retain your freedom of mind? Helping loved ones, leaving controlling people. And I would ask, it'd be very interesting on chat if people are willing to share, how many of us have family members? I have a huge family on both sides, my side and my husband's side, and I won't claim which side it's on, but we have QAnon members in our family. And I bet a lot of us do. And then Dr. Hassan's latest book is The Cult of Trump. A leading cult expert explains how the president uses mind control. So Dr. Hassan is the founding director of the Freedom of Mind. And Steve, the floor is yours. And we're
thank you so much, Anne. And I'm very grateful to be part of this prestigious meeting. And I just want to correct the pronunciation as Hassan. Although the spelling is usually the way you're pronouncing it, Anne. So I'm going to use PowerPoint, forgive me. I did 10 slides that I'd like to share. Let's see, play from start. Can everyone see this? Is this visible?
Yes, it is. And I'll
Okay.
just really quickly, I had people text me ahead of time that they were so glad that you were speaking because they do have family members and friends that are in QAnon, and they were hoping to learn from you how to get them out.
My pleasure. This is my life work, and I have a very different frame than our other presenters. So I'm going to just jump right in and say definitively, I don't like the media saying we live in a post-truth world. The truth is still truth. Facts are still facts. And a lot of cults say you create your own reality. And if it's true for you, then it's true. But I reject that as a social scientist. And part of what we've been missing are scientific tools to define the difference between ethical and unethical influence. And especially in the area of religious practice, which we probably won't have time to get into. I want to talk about PSYOPs, psychological operations, in particular, 4th generation warfare. It was first written about by William Lind in the 80s. And it's basically psychological warfare to delegitimize experts, authority figures, institutions, to confuse, disorient, and to create such a confusion that it makes it much easier to instill authoritarian control. So it's my thesis, and it's in The Cult of Trump, that the cult of Trump is really a combination of Putin and intelligence and right-wing Christian extremist authoritarian cults, white power cults. I wrote about QAnon in it, but the theme is authoritarianism. So I think it's a much more useful frame to think authoritarianism, democracy, and human rights versus left and right. And media and social media, as our last speaker talked about, is really a tool that's amplified what has existed in the past with what I refer to as mind control, undue influence. As a mental health professional, a lot of people don't know, but the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association has had a category for the last 3 volumes, 3, 4, and 5, that explicitly talks about identity disturbance due to prolonged or intense coercive persuasion. brainwashing, thought reform, indoctrination, cults, terror organizations. So it's a thing. And I want to just keep rolling forward because I want to have time to talk. So the idea is that you're not brainwashed and yourself is destroyed, but rather there's a pseudo identity that is created that suppresses your real identity. But there's this tension between who you are and your conscience and your critical thinking and the indoctrination of this cloned identity from the authority cult. And of course, there's a difference between people raised in authoritarian families or cult groups versus people like myself who actually got recruited into the Moonies at age 19 at Queens College. My girlfriend had dumped me. 3 women approached me pretending to be students and deceptively recruited me into the Moonies. Here's photos of Moon being crowned the Messiah in the Dirksen Senate office building with congressmen and senators. This was a while ago. He's deceased, but his cult continues. In fact, they were present at the January 6th insurrection attempt. Moon is best known for his mass weddings, 30,000 couples at one time. He would stand and say, you and you, you and you, and you'd have 5 minutes to decide if you accept God's choice for you. This is one of the most important graphics, and if I had my way, this would be disseminated worldwide in many, many languages. It's what I refer to as the influence continuum, and it's not a binary, it's a continuum. From ethical, healthy, democratic to unhealthy, authoritarian, elitist, controlling. And for the purpose of time, I'll just highlight some other key things that is legitimate. And I talk about cults along the spectrum. People say, you mean you can have a good cult? And I'm like, sure. You know, if you're into something really passionately, whether it's knitting, I'm into scuba diving or whatever, if you're into it and a lot of your time and energy is directed to it, but you have informed consent, you aren't told what you can read and what you can't read and who you can associate with, where you aren't punished or threatened if you want to leave the group, we're on the healthy side of the continuum. And the destructive side of the continuum, as I mentioned before, this pseudo identity that's cultivated, that's completely dependent and obedient on the authority figure, very hate-oriented doctrine versus conscience. Real love on the healthy side versus conditional love. We'll love you if you do what we tell you to do, and if not, we'll beat the crap out of you. And if you ever question, we're going to come after you and make you pay. There's more. This is on my website. It's in my books. But I do want to just comment that Donald Trump has the stereotypical profile of authoritarian cult leaders. It's referred to by Eric Fromm as malignant narcissism. And you can go through the entire list. I give examples in chapter 3 of The Cult of Trump and compare him with Jim Jones and Moon and Hubbard of Scientology. Very important to understand the predator or the predatory organization. And I talk about the BITE model. I saw in the chat people talking about cognitive dissonance theory. I do want to say that I was a fanatic in the Moonies. I spent 2.5 years in it. I was actually directed by Moon to fast for 3 days on the Capitol steps because God wanted Nixon to be president during the Watergate trial. And so when I saw people from my former cult storming the Capitol, I remembered that and how crazy it was because I hated Nixon before I had been recruited into the Moonies. Anyway, what helped me get out was learning about brainwashing and mind control. People like Robert J. Lifton, Margaret Singer, Edgar Schein. But I took their models, and that's all in my dissertation. I have a slide for that, and it's publicly available. I reorganized their themes into Festinger's controlling thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, added information, And then have a laundry list, which is much longer than can fit on any slides here, but it's on my website, where a person can go through those things and see if it's on the destructive side of the continuum or the healthy side. So it's not so content oriented, it's very based on behaviors and specific experiences. I'm going to run forward and just talk about my quest. I got involved with a forensic think tank a number of years ago at Harvard Medical School, wanting to learn about expert witness and what's up with the law. Why is the law so out of date when it comes to the issue of brainwashing and mind control? One of the professors, Michael Comment, said, you need to do a doctorate and you need to do a quantitative study to show that your model works. I said, I wrote my model in the 80s. It's been helping people walk out of cults just by people being exposed to it. He said, no, law needs science. You need to go and do this study. So I did a whole lit review and I offered a framework for experts. And I feel like this is a very valuable contribution to combating what we're facing worldwide. And it's on, I have it on my website. It's published by ProQuest. Anne mentioned a very important program. If you haven't seen it, I really want to encourage you to take the time. I warn you, it's 90 minutes long. It's not a typical TEDx, but it's called Dismantling QAnon. Dave Troy hosted. If you really want to understand PSYOPs, if you really want to understand the professor, is it Kuhil? Yes, was talking about the gaming mechanisms, the addictive gaming mechanisms. I want to credit Jim Stewartson, who helped to develop alternate reality gaming. If you haven't heard those terms, very important. But he said, I helped to develop that 20 years ago, and they stole my stuff and they're using it to harm people. And I'm pissed. And he's now involved with a project called the Thinkin' Project, no G, Thinkin' Project. And we're gathering volunteers who want to help de-radicalize people, especially out of QAnon and out of the cult of Trump. And Desiree Kane is a Native American who spoke about how this game was actually applied in real life in the pipeline controversy, not really a controversy. And I did take my BITE model, it's on my website, and applied it to behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. So I'm urging people, instead of calling QAnon a conspiracy theory, think of it as an authoritarian cult that recruits and indoctrinates people online. So when I was recruited, it was in the 70s, and we went to isolated locations. This was before cell phones even existed. That was part of the methodology for programming us. But now we're bombarded by the most sophisticated algorithms where data has been mined about us so we can be micro-targeted and recruited into vast numbers of different front organizations. But it is much more useful, I think, to think of it as an authoritarian effort aimed at subverting democracy, aimed at subverting America's prestige and power in the world, aimed at inciting polarization, chaos, hatred, undermining rule of law. And I want to state, I'm reading a book by Craig Unger called Compromat about the KGB's influence of Donald Trump. And I'm only into the 5th chapter, but it's a must read for Americans and others. And because of time, I just want to say that when I first was deprogrammed from the Moonies, of course I was ashamed, embarrassed, bereft. How could I have committed so much of my time and energy, dropped out of college, quit my job? I was so fanatical. I was trained to die on command or kill on command. And I recruited a whole lot of people into the group, and I felt so guilty. So back in the 70s, deprogramming, like taking people by force or getting a judge's ex parte conservatorship to have custody for a week was what was being done. And then that got thrown out by judges. And so I stopped doing anything forceful. I didn't like it anyway, but it was largely successful. And I developed an exit counseling approach. But over time, and I wrote Combating in 1988, what I've evolved is essentially what's called a complex systems approach, which is looking at things from the microcosmic to the macrocosmic with increasing feedback loops and decreasing feedback loops. In essence, what I'm advocating is creating an educated network of family, friends, former members, media, clergy, therapists. And the goal is to empower the person to think for themselves and make their own decisions. It's not to talk them out of the cult, whether it's QAnon, cult of Trump, Scientology, NXIVM. The goal is, hey, you're an intelligent person. Explain to me why you believe what you believe. Because if it's true, I want to believe it too. That's the best frame rather than I'm right, you're wrong. What you believe is stupid, or calling them names. It's engaging them, and the people who are going to be most effective are family members and friends who have a long-standing relationship, positive relationship, of course. But the problem has been over the years, many people have gotten so tired of interacting with cult of Trump folks that they've stopped talking to them or blocked them on social media. And I'm really advocating a mass education program where people are interacting again to create a landing spot for people to exit. Lastly, I want to just say a group of former members and myself are doing a hashtag effort called I Got Out. And the goal is to destigmatize the fact, hey, I was in the Moonies, I was in a cult, and life goes on, or I was in Scientology and I got out. So that it is easier for people to have conversations about other cults, not the one that they're now thinking about leaving, learning about these other groups, and then processing in a very specialized way. How did they get me? And it almost always is deceptive recruitment and BITE, controlling people's behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions to create the pseudo identity that's totally dependent. So I think I'm going to stop there, but I have tons on my website. We've been having a lot of website problems. We hope to resolve it in the next 24 hours. So if you get a very slow load, just come back. But there's tons of great material. And please check out the Dismantling QAnon TEDx. Just, you can even Google that if you can't find the link on my website. And thanks to Dave Troy, Jim Stewartson, Desiree Kane, Amanda Rifkin, and other of my colleagues who've been doing the deep dive. Oh, and I want to say Michael Flynn. Michael Flynn is the commander. I won't say he's Q, but he is intimately involved with this mess, the PSYOP that people are referring to as QAnon. There was an excellent 3-part Vice documentary about this. And that's it. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Just a second. I wonder if you would speak to a couple of things, and if all the speakers would. I've always thought the best lie is the lie that has truth in it. And when I thought about why people would believe QAnon, for me, the going into the sexual abuse made sense if there's a large group of people that were sexually abused, so then they would readily identify with victims. But I'm curious as to the other reasons that you think people would go into this. And when my family member called me about another family member that they're really worried about, I had read all your books, Steve. So I told her they're Christians and said, why don't you focus on that and say, the thing that we both so value, even though you've gone down this other road, which I'm not sure about, is our Christianity. So would you be so kind as to explain to me, if I start believing in Q, am I violating our Christianity? Because I know you would never lead me down a road that violates our Christian beliefs. And that would help her to keep the dialogue open, because she was really worried that this family member was going to cut her off, which people do. So I don't know if all of you would be willing to speak about why people believe these lies and how easily they're drawn into them and what we can do about it.
Well, I've looked at some of the videos, the recruitment videos, and I completely agree with you, Anne, that the most effective thing is to use bits of truth. And so one of the big videos that was getting people into QAnon was correctly saying the CIA did MK Ultra, Operation Mockingbird, and Paperclip, all documented, historical, absolutely. But then that's where they veer off. But I want to state again, there are conspiracies, and it's different than conspiracy theories, and you need facts, you need data, you need, and the burden of proof is always on the person who has the, extreme belief claim. And let's review it. So what I was seeing was people being groomed, yes, 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 yes. Then they would insert an authority figure who is former CIA, Roger Steele, who is a bad actor, in my opinion, and involved in the cult of Trump and QAnon. But it gives some authority that there's really stuff here. And ultimately, people need trust. They need to have people they trust again in their life. And the media is so disorienting for so many people, and they cut off whole bodies. And one last thing, and I'll stop talking, is I'm advocating people think about creating trust pods in their lives where they arrange with family members, friends, and not just people who think alike, but people who are critical thinkers, scientific people, to reality test as we go forward, because there's all this stuff getting thrown at us, some of which is just blatantly wrong.
I wonder what you have to say about that, Professor Barkun, because I know when we talked before this talk just together, you were talking about the lack of gatekeepers now in our media and fact checking. And oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
Okay. Good. It's Barkun, not Barkun.
Oh, I'm massacring everyone's name. Sorry.
First place, I'm not really comfortable with calling QAnon a cult, but be that as it may, I think one of the reasons why it is appealing is a characteristic that's common to a lot of conspiracy theories, namely that it makes sense of the world. That in a world that many people find confusing, it claims that there is order. One of the things that happened in the last 30 years is that a model that once made sense of the world, namely that there was this binary opposition between the free world and the evil empire, that the world could be neatly divided between the good guys and the bad guys, simply fell apart in the early 1990s. And we were left with a world that had suddenly become chaotic, where conflicts existed in places that many people either had never heard of or couldn't find on a map. Yemen, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Somalia, you can go down the list. And when you have a world that suddenly doesn't make sense, conspiracy theories become very attractive, because even though they may posit the existence of a force for evil, they also say events are not random. The characteristics of conspiracy theories is that everything is connected, nothing is as it seems, and nothing happens by accident. And in a way, that's very reassuring, because it tells you that the world is not arbitrary, that there is order to it, and that if you believe the conspiracy theory, that the world now makes sense. And the QAnon system, if one wants to call it that, really in its fullest development claimed an extraordinarily sweeping view of the world, a complete conception of politics and international relations. And that's very comforting to say, gee, I have that, and now the world makes sense to me.
That's a very, go ahead.
I agree with this completely. And I think one of the reasons why it's so effective now in the age of social media is because, pardon me, what seems to happen is people latch onto increasingly smaller explanations for increasingly large, what they see as increasingly larger problems. So it's all the Jew bankers in New York is something you used to hear rampantly in the United States in the 20th century, even though the number of Protestant bankers was infinitely greater. And so what I find is we all know, we all have heard the misattributed quote to Mark Twain that the lie goes halfway around the world before the truth is putting its shoes on. And that's because it seems to me that the lie can get compressed to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 words: the Jews, the deep state, the Clintons, and that then ropes people in who don't necessarily even want to spend the time trying to find out the details. If you listen to a lot of the crazy things that the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol said, they didn't talk in detail about what they thought were the background of all these deep state actors. They simply were saying, we want our liberties, we want our freedoms, and we want Pence's head, and we want Pelosi, and all this stuff. The rapidity at which people reduce complicated things down to specific sound bites means that means, in my view, that those things can again spread around the world, when the rest of us who are trying to debunk those things have to explain and know things are extremely complicated. There's all this context, and it just and by the time you're into your second sentence, people are bored to death. They'd much rather hear that it's just the Jews. They'd much rather hear that it's just a deep state. And because that's easier, and it's exactly what everyone is saying, it's more comforting. And it explains everything in a much simpler way that then allows you to sort of sit back and say, okay, now I understand.
So I want to add, for me, I was not looking to leave Judaism and become an anti-Semitic right-wing fascist who believes democracy was satanic. And being in the Moonies was hard. I worked 18 to 21 hours a day, 7 days a week. From people who study cults from the outside, it's easy to say, oh, it's comforting for them to have a coherent message and such, but it's very different in the experience of it all. And I want to say that most people enter out here, and the effective cults make their appeal so generalized that people project meaning into whatever they're hearing from the recruiter, reject everything else, but then systematically they get deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. Then they hear, oh, the Holocaust was necessary because the Jews didn't accept Jesus. Like, if they told me that in the first month, I would have been out the door running. But they had so dismantled my critical thinking and isolated me from family and friends. So I do want to say my work helping people get out of cults, what I've learned is you need to customize to where that person was at. So I always want a detailed profile of who they were before they got into QAnon or into the cult. And then I really want a slow, specified thing of what were the things that really captured their attention, their imagination. Was it a person? Was it a video, etc.? But the way to get out of a mind control authoritarian cult is to take a time out, like stop all contact for a week or two, like no information from them, breathe, sleep, think back to what you thought you were getting into, study models of mind control, and then talk to critics and ex-members, because that's a feature of information control. They don't want you to talk to ex-members or critics. They don't want you to talk to a cult expert, but do it and then reflect over your own experience and say, this fits the bite model or doesn't fit the bite model. And then the final question, and then I'll stop, is if you knew then when you were first joining what you know now, would you have joined? And that makes, and you need to leave a long silence after you ask that question, because it may be 5 full minutes, but if they say, no, I wouldn't, you open that door to further conversation and information.
We have some questions that any of you can jump in on. David Orr asks, what's the difference between Trump voters that just voted for Trump and that were QAnon followers? What's the difference? Raul asks how to help the people at risk to regain their sense of control and agency, which I think maybe, Stephen, you've addressed just now. And Louise M asks about when siblings start pulling each other into a cult. And that's what I saw in the family member that I was called about, that the son was on 8chan, I think, and then pulled his parents into it. And she was afraid that it was going to go further. And she'd been contacted by some family members that were saying, somebody's got to do something. But so if any of you would like to address those questions.
So I guess what I didn't say in the cult of Trump as I did the research for the book was I learned about a cult called The Family. Have you ever heard of The Family by Jeffrey Charlotte and the Netflix series? And it was a revelation for me because Moon went to the National Prayer Breakfast sponsored by The Family. It was started about 80 years ago in the Cold War. You know, the commies are atheists and we need to brainwash for Jesus kind of mentality. And the Moon was brought to meet Nixon to do the fast from that group. And this is a group that isn't just recruiting Republicans, it recruits Democrats too, Muslims too, dictators, death squad leaders, because they want power. So this is a group Mike Pence was recruited into by Chuck Colson of Watergate fame. And then there's a group, a big group in the United States, New Apostolic Reformation, which I characterize as authoritarian cults. They have leaders that say, I'm an apostle or I'm a prophet. I get direct revelations from God. Satan is everywhere. I have the power to cast out demons. But if you leave my covering, you're going to be possessed by demons too. Opus Dei, Catholic right-wing group that apparently William Barr, Pompeo is involved with. What my thesis is that these cults have been evolving over decades. This is not a recent thing with Trump. Trump is a symptom of many decades of right-wing, what's called dominionists, who don't believe in the separation of church and state, and there are Catholic and Protestant groups that came together for the Manhattan Declaration, fighting women's right to choose, gay rights, and they want more religious freedom for them to impose their version of Christianity on everybody else. We really need to, and not to mention, of course, white supremacists, white power people. And Dr. Kuhel, you were talking about the John Birch Society. Do people know that the Koch's father founded that? The one that's saying we need free speech and we need deregulation so we can poison the atmosphere and project that global climate crisis is a hoax?
Well, I don't think people do know that, and I think that that's one of the problems. I'd like to say one of the things that worries me about this, and this is something that Dr. McConnell, Lisa McConnell, asked in the chat, is we always seem to be playing catch up. By the way, I always argue whenever I'm in any sort of social situation, society needs more historians. But what I've come to firmly believe, more important than that, after doing the work that I've done on this, is society needs a lot more social scientists. We need more political scientists. We need more sociologists. We need more people like you, Dr. Hassan. But we're always playing catch up. And I just wonder if there's a way, and maybe some educational psychologists or educational experts on the feed can chime in here, in which we can introduce critical thinking and logic, and especially the introduction of logical fallacies and informal argument, informal logic. Something I took it as a freshman in college and completely opened my world at the elementary level. It's more important, and follow that all the way through. It's more important to me, it seems, than algebra. And I don't know whether that's effective, but I do worry that I mean, it's absolutely wonderful that people are deprogramming people and that we were trying to understand these things. But I just worry that we're always playing catch up, and maybe with technology, we're falling further and further behind. And so that some sort of intervention society-wide at an earlier stage in schools.
Yeah, I think it's particularly important now because people are exposed to a much wider range of ideas than they ever have been before. So that, if you look at conspiracy theories, before some were out there because they had been long-lasting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, anti-Masonic conspiracy theories, some anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. Now, the stuff is incredibly varied and weird. And as you said a while back, debunking is not terribly effective. Even if you have an enormous amount of evidence, it doesn't seem to work once somebody's bought into the system. They'll say, for example, oh, the information you presented is tainted because of the source, or the conspiracy itself has planted the information to mislead you. I mean, you're talking about people who become enthralled with what are basically closed systems. And when you're when you're in a closed system of ideas, you become resistant to contradictory evidence.
And I'd like to just jump on the recent comments and just say, from my point of view, we have a public health crisis, not only coronavirus, but mind control virus, or I should say authoritarian mind control virus. And I totally agree. We need preventive education. We need to train mental health professionals to do interventions and other educators, clergy, and then we need recovery services. Those three things, and we can't wait, as you said so properly, Dr. Kuhil. We need to do this simultaneously in a complex systems way, where we're creating resilient young people who know how to navigate the internet. And I want to just mention three important documentaries that helped me, an old fogey at age 66, understand more about 21st century mind control. The Great Hack was about Cambridge Analytica's mining of our personal information. Social Dilemma which were former executives of the major platforms talking about what's really going on and how addictive they're intentionally made to keep people's attention. And people you may know, companies that are taking the data and selling them to third parties in order to get recruitment into whatever church or whatever group they're into. And this is what's happening right now.
Thank you for that. I want to read a comment that came from Hans Uko, probably from maybe Netherlands. He asks, why is QAnon, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, Unification Church, etc., more present in the US than in Europe? Is de Tocqueville right? Here and there, in the midst of American society, you meet with men full of fanatical and almost wild enthusiasm, which hardly exists in Europe. From time to time, strange sects arise, which endeavor to strike out extraordinary paths to eternal happiness. Religious insanity is very common in the United States. I wonder if that goes with our heritage, that, you know, the people that came here, if we forget our indigenous people, the people that came here, for the most part, came with a vision. I mean, they were visionaries, and, you know, they had to have some fanaticism. I don't know. I wonder what you all think.
If I may take the historian's prerogative just quickly to say, I think it's a bad idea, and it's problematic to try to stretch these things back over centuries and to stretch them back all the way to certain beliefs of people, and that there's an unbroken DNA chain. But there is, as Richard Hofstadter and lots of other people have said, in America, you know, a paranoid style of American politics, and this has always been a problem for a long time. And again, I think partly, if I can answer Hans' questions from my own experience living in Europe, it just, and I hate to say this about my own country and my own people, but it just seems that our elementary education and our secondary public education are so behind and so poor compared to other modern countries that it's not surprising that we have such extremism.
And we have groups that are homeschooling, not teaching science, not teaching history. And it's that anti-science, anti-medicine view that is creating so much concern about vaccine reluctance or hesitancy or not. I do want to say, you know, the IRS decides what's a religion and what isn't. And there's no real criteria other than, you know, filling out the paperwork and saying you had a vision. And if I had my way, if a group says, I want tax exemption status, but I have a right to systematically deceive people into my church, they should lose their tax exemption status. Like, there's no application of basic consumer fraud legislation in the area of religion. And I say, why not? If a religion is legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. It will tell people up front who they are, what they believe, and what's expected of them. And people will be free to leave without threats and coercion. So I think we need not just to go back, but to really start thinking about how to create a society where we have freedom to have a wide range of religious faiths and practices, but where they're basic human rights and respect for facts and the truth.
Wait a minute. Let me chime in with two. I don't know whether they're defenses of the United States, but two qualifications here. One is that with due respect for the fact that the country was filled with native peoples, the myth, of course, was that it was empty, and that it was new, and that great things would happen in a new empty country. And it attracted groups that were experimenting, all sorts of groups. Some, of course, communal groups that remained small and separate. Others that, like the Latter-day Saints, that sought to become large. So I think the very nature of the environment encouraged religious experimentation. Secondly, on the question of religious legitimacy, it depends on who you're talking about and when you're talking about them. If you're talking about the latter decades of the 19th, mid to latter decades of the 19th century, so lots of people, the Catholics were not a legitimate religion. Once you get into the 20th century, if you look at literature that talks about cults, what are the cults? The Seventh-day Adventists are cults. The Mormons are cults. The question of legitimacy is not simply, does the IRS give you a tax exemption? It's also a matter of a kind of social and political consensus about whether you get a seat at the table. And that comes with time. The Catholics got it, the Jews got it, the Seventh-day Adventists got it, the Mormons got it. At the moment, Muslims are in a difficult situation. They haven't quite gotten there. Presumably at some point in the future, they will. But I think the question of religious legitimacy is a very complex one.
Extremely complex. And thanks for saying that. I think that's a really tough thing. And I don't think our governments can necessarily legislate on that, because probably every religion could be seen as a form of mind control. And there certainly are threats in most of our religions. If you leave, you'll end up in hell, you'll burn, things like this. Why don't each of you just take a minute or two to give a closing statement, and then we will end. And who would like to go?
All right. Since there was a moment of silence, I'll fill it. I talked about Q-Anon as though it was separate and clearly bounded, and that's not wholly true. If one talks about a kind of realm of extremism in America today, it does not necessarily have clear boundaries such that there are segments that are mutually exclusive. So you've got QAnon, you've got white supremacists, you've got the Klan, you've got the alt-right, you've got neo-Nazis, whatever. There are a tremendous number of overlaps. And I think we have to recognize that QAnon is not mutually exclusive, and that QAnon people can very likely partake of involvement with other kinds of political orientations on the extremist right.
And I'll just jump in quickly as a historian on the panel and say that we constantly need to remind ourselves this is a centuries-long problem. It's not just because of Twitter, not just because of Donald Trump. Again, the effect of Twitter and the effect of Donald Trump and the effect of social media has been to intensify these things. But it does seem to be this human tendency, and that's why I agree with Dr. Hassan completely that we need an assault on all fronts, immediate intervention, but also, as I said earlier, rethinking some of our elementary school and secondary school curriculum to make space for critical thinking and a study of informal and argumentative logic.
And I guess I'm going to just end by saying that in my work with the Abrahamic faiths, cults, destructive authoritarian cults in the Abrahamic faiths, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, using the Garden of Eden story, however you understand that story, if someone is very religious and believing in God, I ask them, wouldn't you think Almighty God would have brainwashed Adam and Eve to be obedient and dependent if that was part of the divine plan? And by not doing that, don't you think that says something important about our divine spark? And if that's the case, why would God thousands of years later say, yep, it's okay to lie to people, it's okay to control information, it's okay to install phobias so that we, the ends justify the means? And it's a very effective, because you're entering their model of reality and asking them questions. The art of ending blind faith is promoting perspective. And with respect and kindness and compassion, we can help each other lift ourselves out of this mass confusion and polarization.
So we are right at 12:30. Thank you to all of you. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Everyone in the chat is saying thank you so much. Please organize part 2, and we'll see. And thank you so much. It was just really, really interesting. And it is nice that we do have freedom of mind and free will, that we can think these things through and try to figure them out. And I thank you for taking part in it. So we'll end now. And we'll send the chat and the video around later this afternoon to everyone.